us if you can, but otherwise I think it's time to go. So look, thank you as always, everyone, for joining us and giving up your time, and great to see you all. And yeah, certainly a quick and early shout out to Daniel. Yeah. Hey, Heidi. Hey, how you going?
Good, thanks.
That's good. That's good. Good to see. But yeah, special shout out to Daniel. So yeah, well done, mate, and congratulations on the new role. So moving from Surf Lifesaving Queensland on to Queensland Museum Network, Head of Risk and Compliance. So congrats, mate, and all the best for the future career. All right. So as usual, I'm just going to pop a couple of random happy snaps there. So Brodie, any chance you can flick your computer on just so I can try and get a photo of you with your eyes closed, if you can? Hang on, I'll just give her a second. Brodie, you with us?
So she's on mute.
Yep. All right. It's thankfully the call. That's the call.
Sorry, I'm having computer problems. I'm not able to do video.
Okay. No, you're right. No worries, Brodie. All right. We'll just take a couple of happy snaps. And Brodie, welcome. First time to the community of risk management. One of our running jokes is that we're constantly trying to get the illustrious holy grail of photos, which is a photo of every single tile with everyone with their eyes closed at once. That's the dream. That's the dream.
Do another one. I look terrible. I've got my eyes closed.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say 20,000 of them. Okay. All right. So welcome, and let's just get into it because time is money, as they all say.
Time is of the essence here.
That's right. Okay. So I'll just get that moving.
Yeah. Just going to share a Menti.
Yeah, we're just doing a short one today. All right. Why has my internet just died? I don't know why. Okay. Here we go. Coming back now. No, that's all right. We're good now. Okay, we'll present. Okay. If I can just get a thumbs up to check that my video feed is now coming through with you guys. Beauty. Thank you, Jane. So look, if you're not familiar with Menti, just quickly grab a smartphone or a tablet or whatever you've got to hand and just jump into a browser and put in that menti.com address, and it'll prompt you for a code. That'll just let you follow along with us on the slides, as well as ask questions, throw some likes, do some other silly gestures, but we're not doing any fancy stuff today. So today's session is very much, I guess, technically focused, and certainly there's a lot of interest. We've been getting a lot of constant messages and questions about this, so we thought that it was time.
We can take over this whole meeting.
Oh, they're back.
Sorry. Sorry, we're in a room today which usually has good internet, but I think maybe there's some Russian cyber activity going on.
Jane and I just thought we'd take over. We were just coming over to take over the whole thing. So
fantastic. Thank you. Please feel free.
Yeah, I was going to say continue. Please continue. We'll absolutely take you up on that offer, Heidi. So why not? Okay. All right. So hopefully we're back with you now with that slide deck.
And now I feel like we've got to get moving before we lose our internet again.
Okay. So the Boland review, that's the subject of today. We're not going to cover the full breadth of all the recommendations in detail. We're also recording this session because I know there's at least a half a dozen people that weren't able to join but wanted the recording. Yeah. So look, let's just get moving and get on with it.
All right. So I'll kick off.
Yep.
So there you go. House rules as usual. We always love our Kramer GIF.
So yeah, camera and mic on as much as you can. Chatham House rules. So what gets said in the room stays in the room. Always making sure that, look, you don't have to say something for the sake of saying it, but we'd love you to contribute to the discussion, respect each other's perspectives, and obviously beyond all others, have fun and don't take yourself too seriously. So for those that are new to the room, which I think it's just you today, Brodie, that's our little house rules, but let's get amongst it.
Okay.
All right. So the Boland review.
Okay. So first up, the Boland review. So been out for a little while, but we wanted to cover it. As James said, there's been a significant amount of changes that have been adopted in relation to the Boland review, and we get a number of questions. So we thought this would be a worthwhile session. So the ministers from the Commonwealth in each state met in May 2021 to consider their response to the recommendations made by Marie Boland in 2018, and that's called the Boland Review. So by way of background, the ministers responsible for WHS in every state in the Commonwealth asked Safe Work Australia to review the model WHS laws in 2018. So Safe Work Australia appointed Marie Boland to conduct this review.
I think she's a Dr. Marie Boland, isn't she?
I actually think
Yeah,
she is.
yeah.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Yep. So she issued the final report to the ministers in December 2018, and it was published by Safe Work Australia in February 2019. But changes are starting to come to fruition now because some laws are being passed in relation to the WHS Act and regulation in every state. So if you want the full report, you can get the link off the Safe Work Australia webpage. But as James said, we're not going to go through the full report, but we've got a few key things we want to cover.
Yep.
So the review found by and large that the WHS laws in Australia were operating as intended, but she did include 34 recommendations to improve clarity and consistency. So what followed then after that was that meeting of the ministers in 2021, because they wanted to consider their response to the recommendations to work out what each state was going to do and what they were going to adopt universally. So what we want to cover today are 2 recommendations that were agreed and adopted by all states. The first one being the formal inclusion of psychological risks in the workplace, and the second one being the prohibition of insurance against WHS fines. So those 2 were definitely adopted and agreed by all states. Now, a third that was adopted by all states in some manner, but with key differences, is industrial manslaughter, and we're going to cover that today in a little bit of detail as well.
And then also the penalties and penalty units across states and territories. And I think, look, for those that haven't dived into it, that's a whole little bag of complex BS in itself, because they're all different. They're all different numbers across every different state. It's like in true government fashion, they've gone, you know what? We're going to all do it differently just because we can. So anyway,
very true.
Yeah, we'll cover that in a little bit of detail, but also, again, that's a bit of a minefield. And if you're in organizations that are multi-jurisdictional, and that's certainly us included, I guess, it is important that you're across the different, let's call it, changes and applications of those units and numbers, particularly if you work directly with boards of directors in those states. Yeah,
because there's big impacts for officers as defined under the WHS Act. So it's, it's important to be across this, and most organisations operate across a number of states. They operate across a number of jurisdictions. So you do have to be across this. Okay. So first one, psychological risks. Okay. And we've all heard a lot about, there you go.
Any Simpsons aficionados, you know which episode that comes from, and it's a famous one. So there we go.
Okay, so when it comes to psychological risks, the model regulations have now been updated across all jurisdictions, and they place an obligation on the PCBU to deal with psychological risks, including implementing control measures. So Safe Work Australia has issued a model code of practice, which has been adopted and issued by all state-based regulators. So Safe Work New South Wales, for example, they're holding sessions for PCBUs on how to actually implement this. And I'm sure all the other regulators are doing the same or similar. Now, the code of practice for each state, largely similar, modelled off the Safe Work Australia Model 1. Each code of practice goes into a lot of detail on what psychological hazards are. There is actually a really good section in there. There's a variety of industry-based scenarios. So, and all of this sort of information will support you to complete a risk assessment in your business. But when you think about psychological risks and hazards, they're across every industry. I don't think any industry is immune from this. But there's some really good information in the code of practice. Now, we went and looked at every state-based regulator, and every state-based regulator has got their own up on their own webpage. So go and find the ones that you need, because they're out there. But remember, because they're codes of practice, they can be used in a court as evidence of what a PCBU ought reasonably to know. So, you know, whether you're comfortable with the inclusion of psychological risks, including bullying, harassment, aggression, you know, occupational violence and all the other things that come with it, whether you're comfortable with it or not, now that it is a code of practice, all PCBUs, ought to know what's in there and need to be conducting their own risk assessments in that space.
And look, I'll park my cynicism on this because I was going to say I'm one of them. And certainly, you know, there's so many arguments about how psychological claims get included in estimates. And there's a million different arguments about the pros and cons of this. But I guess the reality is, as Bronwyn's saying, is it's there and we've got to work with it. Again, you could be sarcastic and go, well, yet again, here's another code of practice going, do a risk assessment. And you're like, okay, great. Well, that's what the other 76 codes of practice say that follow in its footsteps. But the reality is we think
It's good to see you're not being cynical.
That's all right. I did park the cynicism. Yeah. The best bit in that whole code of practice in my mind is the industry-based scenarios. So if you haven't already seen them, just go straight back to the appendix and look at them relevant to the sectors you work in, because it's actually aligned like a risk assessment table, like a RAC risk assessment. And it is, look, I think they're relevant.
Retail, hospitality, aged care,
mining,
healthcare, like there's really good scenarios in there.
Yeah, and if for those that may have in years past read the Carlo Caponicia stuff or the work cover, the old work cover New South Wales bullying report, there's some really consistent common themes there and about, you know, lack of role clarity, lack of job variance, all these different things that you can see, they actually make good sense when you look at it. So grab those and have a look at it. And at the end of the day, it's ultimately pointing you to conducting a risk assessment for your organization. And it's got some pretty good resources there based on the industry scenarios. So might as well use it.
Yeah. And, you know, the regulations have also been updated in that space as well across every state. And as I said, every state-based regulator has agreed to adopt this, including ComCare, the Commonwealth regulator. So they're all in on psychological risks.
Yep.
So.
Okay. Insurance prohibition.
Okay, that looked like a good slide to include about insurance, Craig.
Yeah, I know. I think Craig, well, Mark's still on there, but I know Craig's dropped off. So this is a photo of Craig in one of his few times that he remained upright and not off in the marbles. But anyway, he's not even here to defend himself. So I'll go.
We better be nice.
Yeah, we'll go easy on him. So look, I think for those that are aficionados of WHS legislation and that sort of, you know, very niche space, there's been this ongoing argument over the years about the fact that it's a disincentive for directors under the previous scheme to comply with duties when they can insure against penalties. And it's a bit like, you know, both of us have been directors of on boards in the past. Whew, wonderful. We just insure against that. We risk transfer out of it and we go. So this one, I think we would all hopefully on an ethical basis agree with, that it's about prohibiting insurance policies. And so it's a prohibition on the insurer or the underwriter to offer it. And similarly, it's also a prohibition on the organisation to accept it. And we've actually seen both in the last 12 months, particularly in Queensland in the not-for-profit space. Insurers seem to have been slow to update their policy wordings. And there was a number of policies we saw that still clearly had that worded in there well past the prohibition. So what it means is you can't just rely on your insurer. It's actually a breach to now accept that policy at an organisation level. Yeah.
So it relates to, that prohibition. You can't take out insurance for PCBUs or their officers regarding WHS fines and penalties.
So penalties.
Okay, so it's fines and penalties, all right? It's illegal to offer it. It's illegal to take it out. So it's interesting to note, though, that you can still obtain insurance for WHS legal costs, just not the fines and penalties. Yeah. Okay. So for lots of good reasons that they've brought that in, we are going to circulate to you after this session an article that came out of the magazine from the Australian
OHS professional, AIHS.
Yeah, Institute of Health and Safety, from December 2021. So we're going to circulate that to you, which contains a lot of information about this prohibition of insurance for WHS fines and penalties. So watch this space. It'll come out on your email.
Yeah, so just be clear for those that those of us that might be on boards, whether it's not for profit or private, the intention behind that is you need to still be able to insure against defending yourself against an alleged matter, but obviously once it is issued to you or you are successfully litigated against it, you can't insure that anymore. Whereas the previous scheme you could, which feels like it was a bit of a gap. So I guess they've closed that gap now. We need to be aware of that.
Yeah, so that was the second one that all states universally adopted. So that's that one.
Yep.
Okay. Now, the third one that we want to talk about is, and hopefully you're enjoying Judge Judy there.
Bit of a blast from the past. Yeah. So those that were born in the 80s would immediately know that.
Oh, you're so dead. Industrial manslaughter category 1 offences. So this has been really interesting. So this was not universally adopted as industrial manslaughter, but get your notepad ready because we've actually got a state-by-state breakdown for you. And again, important information for you, your executive team, your directors, all of your officers, in terms of all the jurisdictions that you're operating in. This proved to be very contentious and everyone dealt with it a little bit differently. So in New South Wales, they did not introduce industrial manslaughter, but they did make a change to the WHS Act. And what they did in category 1 was they included gross negligence in the recklessness category. On the benchmark that it is easier to prove negligence than it is to prove recklessness. So I guess they've kind of lowered the bar for prosecutions there. It's easier to prove that someone was negligent, much harder to prove that they were proactively reckless. I guess so they've kind of lowered the bar there. So that's what New South Wales did. No industrial manslaughter though in New South Wales. Queensland did introduce industrial manslaughter. Okay, and they also maintained all their existing category 1 offences. So it's interesting just to go and have a look about there's little pieces of definitions and things that sit around it slightly differently in each state, but in Queensland, absolutely, they introduced industrial manslaughter. And for all of us that know about Dreamworld, I think there's lots of very strong links here between Dreamworld, the Boland Review, and the introduction of industrial manslaughter. And Queensland were very, very on the front foot in that space. In Victoria, they introduced it, but they call it slightly differently, workplace manslaughter. No real fundamental difference there except the name. But they also maintained all their category 1 recklessness offences. They maintained all their provisions in that space, but they absolutely introduced it. They just call it workplace manslaughter in Victoria.
I think we quantified as well that the most expensive place to be prosecuted, or the most expensive state to be prosecuted in now is Victoria, I think. Isn't that what we worked at? Yeah. So if any of you operate in Victoria, beware, beware, beware. It's the most expensive state to get done over in now.
Yeah. So now in the ACT, if you're operating in the ACT, they did introduce industrial manslaughter and also maintained all their category 1 offences. Okay, so, there's a few interesting things there. The industrial manslaughter is in the ACT is what they call an indictable offence, which means it's going to be held in the Supreme Court. So interesting stuff there. In WA, they did introduce industrial manslaughter as well as maintain their category 1 provisions for everyone in WA. Northern Territory, same thing, did introduce industrial manslaughter. South Australia did not. So South Australia did not introduce industrial manslaughter, and they just maintained what they had already. So no real fundamental change in South Australia. Same for Tasmania. They did not introduce industrial manslaughter and just kept their category 1 provisions in place. ComCare, so they're the regulator for, all of our federal bodies like the Federal Police, Defence Forces, et cetera. They did not introduce industrial manslaughter either, kept all the category 1. So there's a mixed bag right across all of the states and territories, and there is nuances in terms of, you know, is it treated as a crime? Is it an indictable offence? You know, there's quite a few differences. So, you know, I encourage you to have a look at it, but that's a brief summary of how industrial manslaughter got dealt with across the various states. And we know that that's had a lot of airtime. We know that that sort of phrase in of itself, Google it and see what comes up.
Definitely. All right.
And then the last thing that that we wanted to cover was the regime that changed in a lot of the jurisdictions as it relates to the fines and the penalties. So interestingly, as part of all of this change, many state-based regulators moved to a penalty unit regime. So instead of just listing a fine with like a specific dollar value, they now list a fine in terms of the amount of penalty units. So, and these penalty units are all valued as a certain amount, and the penalty unit value increases every year. So what this means is that a fine can be worth a certain amount of penalty units, but the value of the penalty unit is going to go up every year.
And so relevant for New South Wales, particularly in our mining brothers and sisters, there is now a correlation between the resource regulator and the Mines and Petroleum WHS Act. That's now gone over to a penalty unit system, and that is a specific, I guess, you know, attempt to make sure that that correlates now with the New South Wales parent WHS Act, which has also gone to a penalty unit system.
Yeah, so I'll give you an example. So in New South Wales, they've gone to penalty units, and for gross negligence category 1 offences, the fine for a PCBU or an officer is 6,925 penalty units. A penalty unit has a value of $107.47. So that means the fine is just over $7.5 million. So have a think about that. So there is lots and lots of change there, but penalty units is a regime that's been adopted now by about 4 or 5 of the state-based regulators. If you want to know what's happening in your state, just look at the WHS Act, because it will tell you in the Act, it'll say so many penalty units.
Yeah. But as we said, not all states have gone the same. Some have gone penalty units, some have gone dollar values. So for multi-jurisdictional organisations, you need to check, what is it? The devil's in the detail.
Yeah.
On that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's just a bit of information there for you on some really key changes from the Boland review. But I guess we open it up to the floor now for questions, comments and observations.
Oh, yeah. And look, just before we forget, because I just wanted a shameless attempt to throw a Greta Thunberg meme in there to amuse myself. Yeah, next month we'll be joined again by Persia Navidi from Hickson's Law. She's an expert in climate change risk, but specifically climate change risk and its related litigation. So if that's an area that your organisation is exposed to, so think ESG, but this is very much the climate specific aspect of ESG. That's certainly a session you don't want to miss, because it's rare to get a senior partner from a national law firm to come and sort of ad lib on this stuff and talk, let's call it talk shop. So if you've got friends, colleagues, well-wishers who are interested in that space, please make sure you invite them or let us know and we can add them to the list. But we'll now just go over, given that we've closed that one off now, we'd like to hear from you guys in terms of, questions, queries, comments, feedback, observations, the rest. And just like to hear what, I guess, what this stuff, how it's playing out for you guys, and if you've seen any
are your directors or your management teams asking you about this? Is this resonating on their agenda? Are they hearing industrial manslaughter, psychological risks and these sorts of things? So does anyone want to make a comment on what's happening in their space?
I know a number of my clients are asking, can you come and do a psychosocial risk assessment for us? The board's asked, have we got one? We haven't got one. We need to get this done as a priority. So it's definitely, I think, for a lot of people at that senior level, they're hearing about it and knowing that they need to do something.
Yeah, good. It's really starting to feature on their radar.
Yeah. And just with a couple of my clients, it's also engaging with their HR teams as well, because, a lot of this crosses over into the bullying and harassment space, and often they've done work in that space, but not necessarily they've written procedures or policies, not necessarily really considered what the real risks are across the organisation. So, you know, when you get asked to come in and do a piece of work like this, really important if you've got the opportunity to also engage with the HR team or person in the organisation to make sure whatever you do is obviously collaborative with that.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, because a lot of it does cross into the HR space, and it could be as it relates to things like policies and procedures that they've got in place specific to bullying, harassment, you know, et cetera, discrimination. It can also be around leave entitlements as well, considering, and also the mediation and response to it all. So you're right, Jane, it's absolutely wrapped up in everything HR, that sort of psychological safety.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's my sort of experience, you know, since the changes have been made.
Yeah. Beautiful.
Awesome. Ed, you look like you had something to add there.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I haven't been asked about this, but I'm certainly going to now, you know, be pointing it out or checking that particularly the HR team are aware of this, and especially on the sort of the psychosocial stuff, because I think it's also very relevant to working from home scenarios. And as an organization, we are presently, and have been for a while, entirely work from home.
Right.
So
Still?
yeah. I mean, ever since the organization sort of really started in Australia. So I you know, particularly having that code of practice now, I think that's a really good sort of point to you know, leverage to sort of raise it with HR and more broadly, and just sort of check, you know, see what we can do. The other sort of observation I had, which I would be really interested to hear about, you know, possibly, I suppose Persia doesn't really cover WHS so much, but you know, the concept of gross negligence is not a concept that we are all that familiar with in Australia. And I just quickly had a look at the statute, and it's I couldn't see it defined. So I think that's going to be really interesting to see firstly how it's kind of interpreted within a WHS sort of sphere, but also whether it then sort of extends beyond WHS into more general negligence concepts.
But so are you saying, sorry, but are you saying that, do you think Europe and the UK have got a more entrenched or developed understanding in their legal?
Well, certainly the US do.
And
I would say that probably the UK as well. Whereas I think you know, we have more of this recklessness consideration. So
I thought it was interesting New South Wales went that way, on the understanding that it's easier to prove negligence than it is to prove that proactive recklessness. So I thought that was a good introduction when they did that. And we know certainly all of the regulators are getting much more aggressive. That's one thing that we've noticed in their prosecutions, that more and more directors in particular, and anyone considered an officer, they're being very, very aggressive in their prosecutions now, whereas I think they might have been a bit of like a toothless tiger before. They had all the allowances there to make the prosecutions, just never did it. Whereas now we know that there's lots of, you know, well, there's jail terms, a lot of them suspended or fully suspended, but there's a few, you know, directors currently sitting in jail, you know, trying to appeal their sentences as well. So there's a lot of, I guess, more strength in what the prosecutors are doing and bringing about those, you know, prosecutions.
Yeah. And I think if you look at the evolution of the legislation, or let's call it the WHS legislative space over the last 20 odd years in Australia, at least, not being a lawyer, I don't want to go into some sort of attempted semantics debate, but I think it's interesting to see that it's gone from this kind of reverse burden of proof in the old legislation, which most of us probably remember, around this concept of insure, and it put organisations in this like totally disadvantaged position where you could never prove an absolute concept. So therefore they all had to proactively try and plead guilty and hope for a reduced sort of penalty. And then it's moved to this reasonable practicability approach, and it's got quite a let's call it a prescriptive list of how to apply it as your defense mechanism against that. And now I actually think it's in a good place in a way. They've got rid of this bullshit insurance thing, because again, working around heaps of boards of directors, why would you bother investing in something if you can risk transfer your way out of it? You just go, whatever, next, let's look at the financials. So I think that's a good thing. And then, as you said, Bronwyn, you've gone from an environment of a very high burden of proof to making it a little bit easier to kind of get people
Get it over the line.
and regulators. And, whether we're looking more broadly as well, I think we're all seeing, whether it's ASIC, the ATO or other regulators, APRA, that they're going for these strategic prosecutions across the board now. So I think this will open the door, and Ed, maybe that's what you're gesturing at, to the safety regulators potentially being able to kind of grab someone with one of these quite strategic prosecutions in the coming years that will have like a big impact on case law and precedent from that point forward. So I guess that would be our prediction.
And slightly off topic for this session, but I think next month's session on climate change risk and the amount of sort of discussion, I guess, that's going on around greenwashing, I would suspect that the regulators are going to be very, very tough in that space as well. So I'm going to be really interested to hear what the legal team have got to say about that. But I feel like that's going to be really interesting space to keep our eyes across.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So,
I think ASIC recently, the ACCC recently said that it's going to be focusing on greenwashing.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to be the first, really, do you?
No.
No one wants to be Optus right now either.
No. And Daniel, I could see you nodding there. Is that something you've had experience with as well in the past?
I've only been at my new role for 3 days, and already I'm going to have to report to the board next week on our transition to a psychosocial organisation addressing that hazard.
Wow. Okay.
So it's very much on their radar. But I guess one of the things that I think I've seen happen, and I know that it's happening across all jurisdictions because I've got a network that works there, and particularly in aged care, the increased number of claims is skyrocketing. So 7% increase year on year for the last 3 years of psychosocial claims, whether that be bullying, harassment, or, and so, it's certainly it comes at a time when certainly there's much more focus on individuals about what their rights are and understanding about what psychosocial harm actually means to them. But also, the events of the last 3 years into, fire, floods and everything like that. I think it, and obviously COVID and the working from home thing, it's a real serious issue now in terms of organisations about the actual financial impact, either through premiums, work cover, for example, or through being sued. It's really becoming quite prolific, I would say, in terms of the number of claims that people are seeing.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And I think there was an argument a number of years ago, you guys might have heard it as well, from the legal fraternity to suggest that psychological claims should be discluded from premium calculations due to the the relative vagaries of them, and that didn't get over the line. And so I think it's tough. Like, if for any of us that have read the case law on some of these claims, like that, inevitably there's this overrepresentation of government department employees in these like long-term conflicts with senior managers, and then they end up in the court system, and you just look at them and you just go, that's just
It's at 10 times the cost and 4 times the period off of work.
That's right.
And so, but look, I've had a couple of personal experiences with this in terms of managing staff who have made claims and had them rejected.
Yeah.
It's such a massive blow to the person who genuinely believes that they've been done wrong by. And then, what we've done in our organisations is opened up our employment assistance program to provide them ongoing support, because there's clearly an issue that they've experienced, and whether it's valid or not in terms of an actual claim being approved, they are under some sort of stress. And so there are additional costs in that respect where, you normally most EAPs offer three sessions or whatever to counselling, and then after that it's up to the discretion of the organisation. But in the instances of the employees that we were dealing with, we said, well, at this present moment, we're going to allow unlimited access, because obviously they're suffering in some way, and that needs to be addressed. And whether their claim was deemed valid or not by WorkCover is irrelevant to the fact that they are under some form of stress or distress. And that has to be addressed. And I think so, from our perspective, it was a matter of not simply saying, well, we can now walk away because WorkCover has said we've done nothing wrong. Well, that's not the case. You can't, because it's the person is still suffering in some form. And so, I think the organisations seriously are going to have to look at what is going to happen in that space when they do get a claim or of this nature and it does get rejected, about how they're going to deal with that internally after that happens. And I think, there's some serious thinking, and EAP programs aren't inexpensive, but certainly, and I don't think they're very well utilised. I think in the last organisation I was at, was about 3% take-up rate. But I think we're going to see a re-evaluation of those services and how those services need to be provided to staff, and particularly after claims are made and or rejected.
And I think too that the instances as well, which Daniel you've alluded to, is this increase in sort of aggression in the workplace from customers and clients. That has absolutely been on the rise. And, I think mental health issues and sort of how people are feeling has absolutely been impacted by COVID and everything that's come with that, and the change in the economic environment as well. People are under a lot of stress right now. And so, for example, you'd be wanting to train up your Optus call centre right now to make sure that they're feeling pretty good about, how they're feeling about their own psychological safety, for example, because you would imagine they're copping a lot of abuse from people, and, it's not their job to absorb that from the organisation. How do we support those teams in these times to make sure that they feel well placed to deal with all of these things that are coming their way? Right. You'll get a letter the next day from your private health cover and the costs are going up another 10%, and you're already tight for money, and the bank's just written to you and the insurance company's just written to you, and so you're already feeling tense, and then you walk into the cafe and you have a blow up. It just kind of manifests itself all over the place, this aggression between customers and clients and our workers. And it's it's just something that is also wrapped up in this psychological risk space. So
I'd like to pose a question to everybody, and it's something that I've thought about, because in a customer facing environment in which a lot of us work in, do people think that people are losing essential social skills, the ability to actually cope with, because they spend so much time on there, and particularly younger people on their phones and devices, that these issues we see with very confrontational and very explosive reactions of people in situations where they're stressed, and that's whether it's trying to pay a bill or wanting to get a service and being denied, and so you see some very explosive behaviours and very, very quick to react. Do people think that I don't know. I mean, I think there is in terms of social skills about how to cope with getting bad news.
And do you think that that's generational? Just out of interest, Daniel, do you think that it's older, younger?
Yeah, I don't know. Looking through some of the stuff that I in my current role, it tends to be across the board in terms of their age range. But the reporting of negative behaviours is it's one thing that people now need to start to focus on, to actually see trends and stuff in in those interactions, because I think you're going to have to be able to build resilience in your staff to that. And I think that's one of the things that where this legislation is definitely forcing people to move to, is to build that resilience in your staff, and also those coping mechanisms for them in terms of how to respond. And not only at the actual point in time that it happens, but later on when the person has time to go home and reflect on what just happened to them.
Yeah.
And some coping mechanisms about how to deal with those types of behaviours after the incident. Yeah.
Well, what does the rest of the group think? What do you guys think? Do you think that is something you're observing? Yes, no, maybe?
I mean, I think maybe, probably. But I mean, one thing I sort of add is that a former colleague of mine said to me not very long ago, and this was in relation to her 3 sort of late teen children, was that they just don't know how to interact sometimes with, they're more than happy to jump on their phone and interact with to get services and whatnot, but yeah, they find it really difficult to do it face to face. Whether that actually amounts to then sort of having a blow up because they're stressed, I don't know, but I did think that was really quite interesting.
Right. And it's interesting, I'll give you another perspective on that, and this is in my personal space with my boomer parents. So their aggression when it comes to organisations moving them to phone-based or app-based service provision, where they're just not equipped for it and can't deal with it, they'd still expect most of the time to walk into any organisation or workplace and be able to talk to someone face to face. And so those workplaces are shutting up shop. They're just not there anymore. Everything's moved online. It's phone-based or app-based. And then you try and, from my perspective, I try and talk to my parents about, well, you need a phone app for that, and the aggression and the sort of the angst and the worry that leads to a blow up around trying to provide services that way is, that's another way of looking at it as well. I don't know if anyone's experiencing that.
Yeah.
It must be my old parents, but
Yeah, I think also too, there's a report which maybe we can share with the group about the changing way that, let's call it the generational changes in the usage and the types of social media interactions. And we used it recently with a client in the NDIS space because they've got a particular person they're supporting in the younger age bracket, and she struggles with communication, but she's actually very adept at, because of some limiting skills based on her disability, but she's very adept at social media. And there was some research that was interesting to suggest, kind of along the lines of what I guess both you and Daniel are saying, Ed, around that younger generation feeling a lot more comfortable interfacing in different ways to what they previously would have. And then I think, yes, certainly I look around at anything in terms of, even my children, which are sort of both pre-teen, I think there's definitely some challenges there. They prefer to communicate alternately, and they can find eyeball to eyeball communication can be a default aggression type position for them. It's almost like, I think you're aggressive.
Look at me.
Yeah. And all I was going to add there, I was just going to see if you had a thought to add, Mark, from the underground coal space, because I know certainly prior to the pandemic, I was across some statistics with some of our clients in that space that were pretty intense around the amount of personal medical conditions being managed in that psychological space, in terms of the percentage of the predominantly male underground workforce that were either, essentially were medicated for personal psychological conditions. And I always wonder about work environments, particularly like underground mining specifically, where you've got really different workplace cultures and you've got limited opportunity to often support psychological health for men in that case in a way that's contemporary. And I just wondered if that reflects what you guys see, Mark.
Yeah, it definitely does. We've had some here. We're currently at closing, I guess you could say. So over the last couple of years, we've gone from a workforce of sort of 350 and we're down to about 20 at the moment. So there's been some psychological issues that way as well. And we had a couple of fatalities back in 2014. But yeah, it's definitely a different environment. I came to this, I've been in healthcare prior to this. Bit of a change, definitely. And yeah, it's definitely a different environment. And what's tolerated within this workplace or within mining workplaces is very interesting compared to what you'd see going on in the outside world. So,
yeah. Oh, look,
it really is diverse, but yeah. And yeah, look, you're right, James. We do have a lot of people that sort of do try and bring those claims. But I do know that a lot of it's, you know, they write it off. Well, this was work instruction. So yeah. And that's I think the really tricky grey space, particularly on the employer side, around this psychological space and the whole like, well, you know, it can feel really icky around the whole world. What's bullying versus what's reasonable direction versus what's performance management. And so in our both collective experience in education, for example, there's a very low tolerance, I would say, without being too cynical about it, very low tolerance of, let's call it, forthright performance discussions. And they very quickly spiral off into allegations of bullying versus real evidence of bullying. And then I think you're right, Mark, then the opposite you tend to see, particularly in underground coal. It's discipline delivered by who can yell the loudest and swear the most sometimes. And you take that out of that environment and put it somewhere else, and it'd be like there'd be the police called. And so I think, so
anyway, I think it's interesting, and I think it's probably prudent for everybody right now to be starting to look at how they're going to do the risk assessment in their business, or where they're working as it relates to all of this. But I circle back to Jane's really good point about the involvement of HR in this as well.
Mental health first aid. I recommend it to everybody. You need to have people in your workforce now that have been trained in it, because it's just one of the two cases I dealt with were exhausting in terms of the work covers demands on what we had to do and responding, because it's a very drawn out process. You know, they present a brief of evidence, you get to respond to that, and they get to respond back. And so it's just a massive amount of work to deal with it. Just even in the and then of course the actual issue about my main concern was like, okay, we've done and dusted with this process, but I'm still dealing with an individual who's really, really upset, really, really shocked that their claim didn't get up, and then going, well, how now do I fund my own personal treatment for psychological help? And so it's very confronting. It's very distressing for everybody, and it's a lot of work. So I can only recommend that people go and do the mental health first aid. And not everyone has to do it, and not everyone needs to do it. But certainly, I think it's good to have people in your office that actually understand some of the nuances of mental health first aid.
No, look, I can attest to that as well. So thank you for that recommendation, Daniel, because I did it a few years ago, and it was for me, that's a pretty cynical person by nature. It was a really good, really value add. So
I have to do it because I have to work with him.
That's the rampant alcoholism, Bromley.
Can I just add one other one that I've seen with two different clients and in two different industries, is there's been this increase in cases of people, and interesting, is it Daniel, you were saying 100% work from home, organisations that were allowing people to work from home if they wanted to. And now the organisations are saying, well, you've got to come back 2 or 3 days a week, and now people are putting in claims to say, that's unfair, I've been treated unfairly, it's caused me a psychological injury, and then there's other people in the same organisation who have jobs where it's just impossible to work from home. So then they're putting in complaints, and we're having to deal with those people saying they're being discriminated against because they can't work from home. So it's honestly the pandemic and the things that, I knew there would always be challenges of bringing people back who'd been working from home for a long time.
Yeah.
But now, you know, the fact that I have to get on a bus for 40 minutes, my anxiety levels, so you're exacerbating my underlying anxiety. So, you know, I'm going to make you responsible for that. So it's really hard.
Yeah.
The
And
important word there was underlying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right.
Yeah.
Pre-existing, isn't that the term?
Yeah.
Oh,
Yeah.
but you had like look, it was, you know, I've been through that, having to go, okay, well, they've admitted to an underlying problem. Well, was that it? Is that our issue that they've
That's right. And you used to work in the office.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
So anyway, just an observation, and I'm sure
Also too, you flogged all your gear, you moved at home, and now there's no gear at work. So bring that back too. Yeah.
That's right.
And I'll put in a shoulder injury because I was carrying my monitor over my arm.
The other one as well that's worth reading, and I'll see if I can dig it up and find it, but there was a Deloitte's report. I was thinking it was the back end of the first bit of COVID that was hypothesizing about the fact that particularly in Western Europe, that's like, yeah, that's Spain and all that sort of area, that this type of stuff was going to exacerbate existing division between high earners and low earners. And it feels a bit like this kind of could be coming true in a way. So if you're in a role that chances are you can't physically work from home because it's operationally not possible, that can drive sort of systematic disadvantage for you versus those that can, because traditionally they're usually university educated, they're probably working in more of a white collar environment. They're
knowledge economy.
Yeah, it's knowledge, they're knowledge workers, and you know, and therefore that's probably going to sit you further up the food chain. And there's a whole bunch of stuff that lives with that. And I have no doubt that in 20, 30 years time, our sort of children or whatever will be reading the research that's come out on the, let's call it the long-term changes or whatever that's triggered. And I just, that came to mind, and I'll see if I can find that Deloitte report.
It'd be really interesting if you can.
But really nobody wants the nurse or the person stacking the shelves at Coles to be working from home, right? So,
and this is where you know, healthcare is one industry that I'm working with that we're seeing that, but even another industry, just a corporate environment. But it's, you know, and I don't know. I don't think there's any real clear answers or easy answers to any of that. It's
What about that? There was that Batuta thing saying, "Oh, taxi drivers are going to work from home today," or whatever. Like, like these essentials. It's like cops. Like, are they going to work from home? Like, really?
Yeah.
So it might have been about 3 months ago, though. There were some studies done that came out about, you know, office environments around open plan offices and how that had been. That the research had demonstrated it had been detrimental to productivity. Yeah. So, I mean, this comes in cycles, I guess, and you know, we see this. And I guess the main point here about this whole discussion is, okay, how do we trend that line up and not down in terms of our safety requirements? And so, but there are some very simple things we can do internally, and they're not very expensive in regards to how we can assist with psychological safety.
Yeah.
And they're real practical things about, you know, connecting with people and, you know, and whether
having a conversation.
It doesn't have to be in person. It can be on Teams, or it can be, but it's there's some really very simple things about what we can do in this space, and it doesn't have to be very expensive at all. But
no, and I think that's probably a good point to close on, Daniel, because certainly I think that's what we observe anecdotally, and organizations that do this stuff right, and it collectively contributes to culture, they tend to suffer a lot less dramas on the downside than those that kind of, you know, rail against it and resist it. And some organizations we come across, they do it without even realizing they're doing it, particularly if we notice it in sort of care advocacy based organizations. They tend to be, like you said, Daniel, really good communicators, and they give a shit about each other. And then that often acts to moderate downside issues kind of even before they've arisen. So anyway, what we might do, guys, because we're just about to shoot the clock, so we really appreciate everyone's attendance. And look, that was a really lovely, buoyant discussion today. So thank you everyone for your contribution. And look, we'll get the article out to you as well about the prohibition of insurance for WHS fines and penalties. So we'll shoot that out when we send out the recording. Yeah, and I'll see if I can dig up that the other studies that we referenced. But look, as we said, please make sure if there's people in your network who you think would benefit from this climate litigation piece, because it is like for all of us that work in this space, it's probably the biggest sort of like hot button issue at the moment in general. I'm certainly going to be bringing some colleagues in from New South Wales Department of Innovation, I think Kelly's from, and they're very much similar to New South Wales Health. They're really getting hammered by this like mandated requirements around, I guess, proactively managing climate risk. And so I think it's just really pertinent to get across that for your organisation. So anyway,
Okay.
All right, guys. Well, look, thank you as always.
Lovely to see you all again.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys, for facilitating this forum. It's really good.
Yeah,
Cheers.
no,
All
thanks, Jane.
Yeah,
Talk
thank you,
soon.
everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Okay.
Ciao, Brad.
Good to
See you,
back.
Sheridan, Daniel, Heidi, Jane, Ed,
See you guys.
Mark. Ciao.
Everyone.
Okay,
Okay.
see you. Bye.
Bye.